Iran is planning to test nuclear bomb detonators. That's according to exclusive reporting by Iran International. This comes at a volatile time as Iran and Israel are on the knife edge of an all-out war. But how would this potential conflict devastate a region that's already crippled by economic crisis, immigration, and political instability? We'll be speaking with political scientist and international relations expert, Professor Bessma Momani, to answer that question. I'm Negar Moshehedi, and this is Eye for Iran. Bessma Momani joins us now. Thank you for being here, Bessma.
Thank you.
We've talked for the past several weeks about, quote unquote, an imminent attack from Iran to Israel, yet nothing has actually happened. We've seen NOTAMs issued, military drills, and even threats from Iran's supreme leader warning of, quote, divine wrath. And now we're learning from exclusive reporting by one of our reporters, Mojtaba Pourmohsen, that Iran is planning to test nuclear detonators. Now, is this latest development related to the greater conflict at large? Bessma, what's the deal here?
It probably is. I think it's part of the psychological warfare as well that I think we're seeing really trying to intimidate the Israelis and the wider region. So it's not a surprise. But, I think there is a lot of, for lack of a better term, playing chicken here. Everybody is really trying to push the limit as far as possible. That's the only way to explain, particularly I think on the Israeli side, what I think are very, very brazen attacks that we're seeing constantly. And then again, the Iranians responding, particularly in April, with 300 missile attacks into Israel as yet another sort of response that is at the brink of war and descending into an all-out war, but never quite crossing that threshold. So it's a really interesting and very sad game because, of course, it's often the innocent civilians really caught in between.
And are we close to nuclear conflict in the Middle East?
Well, certainly I think in the past at least 25 years that I've been observing things, it does feel like we are closer than ever, only because of this game of chicken that's being played by the two parties, in particular the Iranians and the Israelis, which, at least to our knowledge, are the two countries most close to. Certainly I think the Israelis, most analysts suspect that they do have, nuclear capabilities, and the Iranians are close too. So I would say this is the closest we've ever gotten. Certainly trust is at its lowest. I think one could even argue that the Iranians may see that they have an incentive to acquire as close as possible to that threshold of nuclear weapons in order to, again, really create that kind of deterrence from attack. But I don't think we'll see it happen. I think there's just enough recognition, I think internationally, globally, that any sort of nuclear response would just, I think, be a response of in kind, and it just is not a win for anybody.
So what would you make of some experts are saying that this is making it the most dangerous conflict we've seen between this shadow war between Iran and Israel in decades? Would you agree with that assessment or not, if you think this is a game of chicken that's not going to come to fruition necessarily?
I still think it is the most dangerous we've seen because the challenge is shadow wars can become hot wars very quickly when one little thing goes wrong, like a stray missile. That really is the fear. The fear is not so much that either side wants to completely go into a full-out war, but the fear is that there is a mistake, or again, a missile goes awry and hits a civilian population, and that really creates this crescendo of unexpected reactions that really make it intolerable for any political party to continue to play the game of chicken and to really instead shift to a more all-out war.
Speaking to that, how would you assess both sides? Are both sides rational in your view? Like rational actors here?
Yeah, I guess as a political scientist, we have a very clear definition of a rational actor. And I think, yes, they are both, in a sense, rational actors when you take them in their totality. That doesn't mean every actor in the Iranian conflict, at least currently today, don't have their own kind of grand vision. I'd point out that I think in the Israeli cabinet, you have definitely many members of the cabinet that are absolutely, I think, apocalyptic in their views, certainly do have extreme goals, complete ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians in particular, and at all costs. And so in that way, as far as the rational actor, goes, yes, they're rational actors individually, but their broader ideological goals, are really, I think, far more than calculating. It's really, I think, at this point, descending into one that is sort of irrational. And the same could be said for many actors within Iran as well. So yes, there are unfortunately these individuals who, for their own purposes, whether it's grand visions, whether it's increasingly seeing this through a broader ideological or religious fanatical lens. There's just too many actors of that type, frankly, in both Israel and Iran, who could really, I think, tip the balance and make this a very hot war.
And how do you think that they view each other in that sense, in terms of the ideological sense that you're speaking here?
Well, I mean, I wish, at least from the outside, I think, it's easy to see that they're both motivated by theocratic goals of a grander, religious purpose. It's hard not to see a lot of the kind of similarity in a way, but they're different actors, I would say, certainly. I think in the Middle East, at least, particularly since Saudi Arabia has become a bit more liberal over the years, those are the two countries that still stand out to be very theocratic in its sense, in terms of really attaching the state to a religious ideology. But how they see each other, of course, obviously, the Israelis see every action that comes to them, and every activity, particularly the atrocious attacks of October 7th, through the lens of being motivated completely by Iran. In fact, I think they have a tendency to blame Iran for a lot of things that are not necessarily Iran directed. They could be certainly Iranian involvement, support. Certainly one can't discount the support Iran gives to Hamas, both in kind and materially. But I think it's very clear, analysts would point out, that October 7th was wholly an internal decision, and probably didn't even include a lot of the external representatives outside of the Gaza Strip in the Hamas entity. So I think that's one thing. Certainly the Iranians believe that the Israelis are very much expansionist, and it's hard not to see that happening in the West Bank. Certainly what's happening in Gaza looks more than just an attempt to defeat Hamas. It certainly looks like there is broader attempts, and no shortage of statements coming from many right-wing cabinet members who see this as an ultimate goal of reoccupying Gaza to very much cleanse out the Palestinian community there. So I think it's easy to see how there is no trust in either party, how neither of them see a way for each of them to thrive without sort of either the destruction or at least the minimization of power from the other side. And that really is a very dangerous equation, if you will.
And you also mentioned Saudi Arabia and some form of liberalization. What role does Saudi Arabia play here in this, as you phrased it, a game of chicken between Iran and Israel?
I mean, I think what we can see is in the past few years, they do feel as though they're caught in between, they've felt as though they have often been at the site of a proxy war that's happening in the region writ large, particularly with the attack on the Aramco site. I think that was really stood out to them as how they were caught in the middle. Of course, they're to blame in some way for being so-called caught in the middle, because they really are the ones that pursued the disastrous war in Yemen, and I think they did a lot to antagonize the situation there. Particularly, I think that only made it into a self-fulfilling prophecy where much of the Houthi rebels were probably not really aligned with Iran before the actual civil war, but increasingly did become very much supported by Iran. So unfortunately, the accusation of Iran being involved in Yemen preceded the reality of them being actually involved in Yemen. So that, of course, means that the Saudis see themselves as sort of caught in the middle of a potential Iranian-Israeli hot war. They certainly are geographically located in the middle, so they can't escape this. I would say the kingdom today really wants to do business and not be involved in geopolitics nearly as much as they were in the past. They have big dreams on what they want to achieve, and they can't do that if they don't actually attract foreign direct investment to the country. So having any hot war in the region, the neighborhood effect means that they will be absolutely hurt by that and see a lot of cost and no benefit to it. That said, I think the Israelis and the Iranians do want to, and for their own purposes, really bring in the costs of a potential hot war. So the Israelis are trying to make it clear that this would any sort of conflict with Iran would be devastating for the region too, and the Iranians likewise, because I think it serves their interests to each have the other sort of be walked away from the brink, if you will.
Can you elaborate more on that?
Yeah, I think that, when you look at, for example, we've often talked about both Iran and Israel not wanting a hot war. And I think there's something to that. I think there are individuals in each country that, are probably, again, far more apocalyptic than we would like. And it's really hard not to see those statements through those lenses. But at the same time, I think they all recognize that this is not healthy for their economies. It's not healthy for their countries. They all have a vested interest in, such as shipping lanes being smooth operating. No one wants to see the Persian Gulf, inflamed. It's a mutual interest to not see the region sucked into a broader regional war. I think for all of us watching this, it's really, we're all kind of on knife's edge, because it's really that worry that one move might just go wrong, and this game of chicken just becomes one that you can't control. And so how do you ensure that the parties don't engulf into something like this is going to be a really difficult diplomatic channeling.
And you talked about the economic impact, and Israel's credit rating has just been downgraded by Fitch amid these rising tensions in the Middle East. Can you speak to that and what your outlook is on that view?
Yeah, that's not surprising. I mean, one, of course, there are many people who are not at work in Israel today, either because they're in the army or in the army effort. Also, we have a lot of businesses, both in the north and the south, that are shuttered because they are become effectively new buffer zones for the wars with both Hamas and Hezbollah, both south and north. So I think it is definitely hurting. But I think, as much as the economics is important, I do think you can't ignore that someone like, Benjamin Netanyahu is trying to avoid potential prosecution, potential corruption charges being laid against him, and sees that his survival as an individual politician is very much tied to the war effort continuing.
So are you saying that,
cabinet.
Sorry to interrupt, so you're saying that the Prime Minister of Israel wants to drag out this war for his own interests?
I can't help but see that being a very important factor in this that we don't give enough credit to. It simply does not make sense. There were many opportunities for there to be a ceasefire. We heard Biden talk about an Israeli proposal for a ceasefire that looks exactly like the same terms and conditions that we're still talking about today in Doha. So the terms and conditions of a ceasefire haven't changed. What is, I think, hitting Netanyahu is the reality that his cabinet would fracture. He's, as I said, got fanatical groups and individuals in his cabinet that absolutely do not want this war to end, because they do want to reoccupy Gaza. And I think they want to expand this conflict into the West Bank in a way that would lead to the complete exodus of the Palestinians in the West Bank. And so I think there are individuals, and particularly Netanyahu, who do think that an end to this war would mean an end to his term, and not just an end to him as in he would lose hold on power, but again, might face actually criminal charges for the corruption charges that are upon him and his wife in particular.
And so when it comes to Iran and the threats that they made against Israel, why do you suppose they would do it and then not go through with it? Does it not make them look weak in the world stage, or is Iran actually benefiting from this too?
Well, I mean, there's some psychological benefit in their mind, right? That they are really keeping Israelis on a knife's edge, which they have been since Haniyeh was assassinated. The Israelis have been effectively thinking it could happen any day now. Constantly messages sort of portrayed as such. We've obviously been following the news intensely, and every other night you hear yet another, it's going to be tomorrow, it's going to be tomorrow, and all these indications, whether it's...
Each day it's today.
Yeah, exactly. So, I think that does serve Iran well to play that kind of psychological warfare against Israelis and to really relay the message that there's a cost and a price to the assassination of Haniyeh within Tehran. So, I think there's that benefit, but I don't think any of us know when that's going to happen, if it's going to happen. Certainly one doesn't even know whether Hezbollah and Iran would coordinate. I think they would. Some argue that that Hezbollah would react first and Iran second, or maybe even a complete use of proxies and not Iran. I would still suspect that the Iranians, if the Doha talks that are happening today on Thursday do continue and don't break down and all goes well, then I think if we do get a ceasefire, I think Iran will commit to not having a retaliation. But I think if the talks completely disintegrate and there's no conclusion, I don't see how Iran can get away without doing something, particularly to save face. But that, again, the gamut of what that could include, it could be, as we saw in April, attacks, missile-type attacks that are very scary from the sky, but on the ground, we didn't see nearly as much damage. One military facility, one individual that got killed, but it looks like it was, again, another errand of a missile gone awry. So again, trying to avoid civilian damage. It could be everything from a cyber attack. Both these parties, both the Iranians and the Israelis, are very strong in their cyber capabilities and trying to inflict damage that way.
Yeah, we saw a cyber attack in Iran recently, actually, with the ATMs.
Absolutely. I mean, I think Iran has been subject to many, many cyber attacks, Stuxnet being one that many of us who look at cyber security still study very effectively in terms of how viral it can be and damaging to systems. So yeah, absolutely. I think that's certainly one option. But I would also point out that, in the realm of what I think is a tit-for-tat here, we can't ignore the reality of perhaps an Israeli official being targeted in some way.
Really?
I really do feel that, which I think is, it would really be, again, yet another potential mistake. But if
so, not intentional is what you're saying when you say mistake, or somebody who's irrational making that decision. What do you mean by that?
No, I don't. I think it would be a mistake. I'm saying it would be a plan. It would be again. We have seen, of course, Iran use some of its proxies to target Israelis abroad. Obviously, Argentina being the most sort of infamous, if you will. I think that is not out of the realm of possibility. I think they would definitely try not to hit, an Israeli within Israel, but an Israeli outside of Israel. I mean, it's really sad, but that's the kind of, I think, calculation that may be happening in Tehran in a way of actually going after someone at that level of an assassination that is in keeping with what they did to Haniyeh, but at the same time, not on Israeli soil to yet again signal, again, that tit for tat, but not push things to an all-out war. That's, again, no one knows if, what either side is thinking of, but the truth of the matter is one can come up with many, many different scenarios, and all of them really end badly, as I said, as miscalculations really create a life of their own.
And is Iran capable? We've spoken to a lot of experts who say Iran is incompetent when it comes to intelligence and carrying out these assassinations.
I mean, again, they have been successful in the past.
That's
right?
true.
So it's really hard to say they're incapable. I mean, being incapable doesn't make it, morally just. But I don't think that that they are incapable. I think they are very much capable. They have a huge network globally, particularly with these proxies, and I think increasingly with this horrific war on the Palestinian people in Gaza, I think they're also going to find easier recruits than ever who want to sort of hurt the Israelis in return for all the pain and suffering inflicted on the Palestinians. So unfortunately, this is probably a time that, if the Iranians wanted to recruit people, they would find an easier time to do so.
And and Iran in the past has even recruited high-level gangsters like the Hells Angels in Canada. They were trying to carry out an attack in Maryland on an Iranian dissident as well. That was obviously foiled by the FBI, but as you said, they are looking for recruits, and they're not necessarily ideological if the price is right.
Indeed, and I think the criminal world, the underworld of criminals today is growing vastly. Unfortunately, and with cryptocurrencies making it a lot easier to sort of make those kinds of payments, it is unfortunately a very, very, very dense underground network that they can tap into for the right price.
And you spoke about the greater regional conflict and the impact that would have. In last week's episode of our podcast, we spoke to an Israeli Knesset member who hinted that Israel's next move may be in Lebanon against Iran. And that it would all play out there. What impact would that have on Lebanon socially, politically, and economically?
Well, devastating. I mean, most Lebanese don't want to be the site of a proxy war between Iran and Israel, and unfortunately have been for a very long time. And I'd say even Hezbollah, recognizes the fact that most Lebanese do not favor such kind of involvement. So even Hezbollah, I think, has tried to be restrained a little bit. And you can see that in the numbers in some studies that have been done. It's about a 4-to-1 ratio, and that it takes about 4 Israeli attacks, targets of some kind against Hezbollah assets for there to be one return. So that to me, on a very numerical level, suggests that there's a bit of a restraint there. But, I think Hezbollah, like any organization, also has its own ideology and has its own stakeholders who expect a response. The man that was killed is a very high-level individual that was killed in Beirut, and it was after a warning by Nasrallah himself to not target a Hezbollah operative in Hezbollah territory, which is exactly what the Israelis did, again, in comparison to Aruri, who was a Hamas operative in Lebanon. So I think the Israelis have crossed a few what are red lines established by Hezbollah. Again, I think poking the bear, and again, these are actors that do have their own stakeholders and vested interests, and as we said earlier, do want to save face to their members. So it is true. I do think that Hezbollah is more keen to respond, but I think it's about balancing that with the domestic challenges they face of a country that is at the brink of economic collapse, absolute full disdain, I would say, by the majority of the population in Lebanon, who do not want to see an all-out war with Israel.
And would Hezbollah take that into consideration, or would you describe them as taking Lebanon hostage? How would you see it?
I would say it's a balancing act. I don't think you can ignore. I remember here, Hezbollah is certainly deemed to be a terrorist group by much of the Western world, but inside Lebanon, it operates as a political party with representatives in the parliament. It actually competes. So it does have a vested interest to keep the Lebanese people on its side so that it votes for it. So it can't completely sideline the public interests. And so I think it's a balancing act. And that, again, is... it's a very delicate one to analyze from the outside, because they're not completely going to act solely in what is their interest for the group as an entity. They also have a domestic constituent that they need to think of.
And what are the views of Lebanese in general when it comes to Hezbollah then, as a political party then?
It's a mixed bag. Certainly, they tend to get a lot more support from mostly the Shia community in the south, but not exclusively. For some, in particular, in keeping with what's happening today, it's very clear to many Lebanese that there are a lot of antagonistic behavior of the Israelis in really poking at the bear that is Hezbollah. And so, sort of being a bit more sympathetic to Hezbollah in that way is certainly higher, I believe, than perhaps, maybe even a year ago or 2 years ago, or even 4 years ago, which were just on the anniversary of the bombing in the port of Beirut, which many Lebanese still believe has Hezbollah fingerprints over it for their incompetence in really storing the kinds of chemicals and material there that led to the explosion. So I think, it's a mixed bag, if you will, and it fluctuates. But generally, I think Lebanese people are just tired of being a site of proxy, do not want to be involved in the regional conflict, i.e., be a playground for, Israeli-Iranian interests who are using Lebanon as a place for this proxy war.
Would we see a mass migration into Europe?
I mean, I think if people could have left, they would have left by now because the economic situation has been horrendous for at least the past 4 or 5 years. So I think that, people who could leave, I think, would have left. But Lebanon has one of the largest communities of a diaspora that, work abroad and return, particularly in the summers. So today, Lebanon is full of a lot of expats who are returning home, visiting. And so it would be worrisome. Certainly here in Canada, we have a large dual citizen community that would be, affected by this. And that's why we see so many Western capitals really make an effort to announce to their citizens to leave as soon as possible in the case of Lebanon.
Now let's talk about the United States and the impact that they're having. Recently, 7 U.S. personnel were injured in a presumed Iranian rocket attack at the Al-Assad air base in Iraq, but we haven't seen anything from the U.S. Congress, addressing this, and no consequences for Iran. Why is that?
I mean, I think probably because I think the Americans see that this is already a powder keg. I think there's plenty to sort of unpack that's very much Iraq specific as well. So it's probably something for a longer conversation at a different time. But I would just say that I think, they really wanted to try to keep these separate. This is probably just, I think, just a way to deflect more tension from the region in many ways.
And, obviously, I know you can't see into a crystal ball and tell the future, but given your expertise, how do you see this all ending between Iran and Israel?
I don't have a crystal ball. Exactly. We don't know. I think it really will depend on the next few days. Again, if we can get a ceasefire deal, and I think the only way we're going to get a ceasefire deal is if the Americans actually put real pressure on the Israelis. I think it's become clear that is where the leverage has not been used. The so-called bear hug approach that Biden has used against Netanyahu or with Netanyahu has been ineffective. And so I think it needs to be a serious attempt to push on the Israelis that if they don't sign a deal, they will not keep supplying them and arming them throughout this war, which is what has been happening. And unfortunately, yet another shipment of arms was received just a few days ago. So it really, for all the American bluster of actually being invested in this ceasefire, frankly, I haven't seen real assets being used to leverage and real sticks and carrots being used to stop this war. And so that's something that I think the Americans are going to have to really contend with.
All right. Thank you so much, Bessma, for your time. We really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Thank you. You can always weigh in on the discussion in the comments below. We'd love to know what you think. The Eye for Iran podcast series is created by Iran International, the go-to destination for expert Iranian news in both Farsi and English. For more, head to our dedicated English website, iranintl.com/en.